download jQuery from jQuery.com and rename the file to have a more generic name, like jQuery.js. That is so that you can switch from the uncompressed version to the compressed version when you deploy, and so you can upgrade to a later version without having to edit your HTML file. So you just replace the single file in your scripts folder. Load an HTML file for practice, just as we did before, but this time the HTML file should have some interesting things in it, a few HTML elements, maybe some nested elements, and it should load jQuery.js. Now, when you bring up Firebug and you practice interactively, A, jQuery is already loaded so you can call jQuery functions, like $ something or another, and B, there are some interesting HTML elements in the page that you can try to manipulate. And the two things you should practice with is matching CSS patterns and then doing something with the things that match. All right, jQuery is big. jQuery is medium complicated. Basic things are actually surprisingly simple compared to doing it in raw JavaScript, but still it's kind of complicated. And so I'm giving a basic introduction to jQuery, and I'm going to cover 80% of the things you're likely to do in real life, but not every single one of them. So just as I suggested that you have a JavaScript reference on your desk, like JavaScript, the Definitive Guide by David Flanagan, you might want to also have a jQuery book and reference on your desk as well. Now, it turns out that the API and Learn websites are quite extensive and quite well written. And so some people just forgo a printed reference and use the online reference. I just want to mention the difference between those two. The top one, api.jQuery.com, is geared towards specific methods. If you want to know exactly what the hide function does and exactly what the arguments are, you look up the hide function and it very specifically tells you. So every function in jQuery is listed there with explicit detail on what the arguments mean and what the return value or the behavior is. However, if you're a beginner, you don't know what the function name is. And so if you're a beginner, the second site there, learn.jQuery.com, might be better. These are higher level tutorials. You know, how to get started doing this, how to get started doing that. And some of them give a bit more detail than I will cover in this video. So after you've gone through the video and you have questions, especially detailed questions about all the possible function calls, go to the online site and you can learn a bit more. Finally, as always, practice is the key. I've kicked that dead horse once. I'm going to keep kicking that poor dead horse. You don't learn just from listening. You have to try it yourself. So the first thing you should do is go to the CourseService.com website, click on the JavaScript tutorial, go down to this section having to do with the introduction and overview of jQuery, getting started with jQuery, and download the example, in particular the HTML file that did nothing but define a few elements, load jQuery.js, and load a CSS file. Bring that example up in Firebug and try some things out. Go through the process I did. Make sure the $ function is defined. Search for various patterns, but try a whole bunch of patterns that I didn't give examples of. Review your CSS lecture and try all sorts of patterns that you learned in that CSS lecture that I didn't do in my very short interactive example. And experiment, play around, and see what you get. Once you've experimented with the CSS selector patterns, experiment with applying a few of the functions to the results, in particular hide, show, and add class. Once you've done that and you've experimented to a great extent, then, and only then, after you've interactively practiced, try some of the exercises that I have listed on that site.